This is the first video I plan on doing when I use my new green screen wall. I painted this wall. Dragon Quest has been in the news recently, and now might be a good time to admit that I never played it. It's one of those games that's always been on the periphery of my gaming experience. Like when I would talk to someone about how awesome Chrono Trigger is, Dragon Quest would come up. The art for both games is done by legendary artist Akira Toriyama.
Hello, bird. What is your name? Toriyama. I would love to see your dinosaur.
The main problem is that there's too many games. Just way too many games. I have been meaning to give the series a go for quite some time though. So let's see if this upcoming Dragon Quest III remake is the right game to do that with.
バカな国とね、やるの本当めんどくさい。でそっから日本も悪影響を受けてやってるから。
Oh no! This will probably be a bit different from my normal videos. I don't normally cover news, but I found this story so interesting I want to take a stab at it. Hopefully I can edit this fast enough so this video will still have a degree of relevance.
This was a huge mistake.
Now most of the hullabaloo online seems to be based around perceived censorship of characters from the original Dragon Quest III, which came out in June of 1992. That makes it older than the Bill Clinton administration. There are Japanese kids playing this game who had never once heard the name Monica Lewinsky because no one had heard that name. Yet! Okay? Dragon Quest III is a very old game, which means that there has been plenty of time for fans to get real attached to its specific styles and eccentricities. Which I'm not knocking. I love fan passion. It just means that Square Enix was already messing with fire when they started to make this project. I mean, I've seen Kingdom Hearts AMVs, Final Fantasy AMVs. Square Enix fans are passionate about their games. I mean, you gotta be passionate to understand a thing about any Kingdom Hearts anything.
Good! I am over the heart-shaped moon! Thank you!
Now let's go ahead and see them controversial design choices. For example, you've got this troll enemy who has had his lippage toned down by a significant margin. Most of the problems do seem to be centered around a number of the female characters. This bunny girl, for instance, had her cleavage and thighs covered more. This cleric is facing persecution for Christianity and now must worship Poseidon for unknown reasons. And the real big point of contention is this female warrior design. They decided that the original was too scantily clad, so they made her wear a sports bra and shorts under her armor. I'll touch more on her later. Don't take that last sentence out of context. I don't like that.
So we're just done with phrasing, right? That's not a thing anymore?
They also changed the name of a town from Isis to Ibis. Admittedly, that one, not entirely fair to judge them on. They certainly weren't expecting that word to eventually be associated with this. Now, when I first heard about controversy surrounding this game and I saw these pictures, I figured, truthfully, it wasn't that big a deal. Not that I love remake design changes, but these seemed relatively minor, and I figured they were just bigger cultural fish to fry. If it was truthfully just this, I wouldn't bother. I wouldn't waste your time with that. But there's more than that. Because there are two details that I found out that actually make this a really interesting story. So let's go ahead and dig into those. If you're a Dragon Quest fan, you might already be yelling at least one of these facts at me, just straight to your screen, and believe me, I can hear you. The first fact that makes this an interesting story is that, as I mentioned at the top, Dragon Quest, from its earliest inception, employed legendary artist Akira Toriyama as a character designer. And if you somehow aren't familiar with Akira Toriyama, he made Dragon Ball, which is arguably the most famous manga and anime of all time. A literal generation of children have all tried to scream themselves into a power-up and shoot laser blasts out of their hands because of this man. One thing I didn't know when I sat down to write this video is that Dragon Quest was actually Mr. Toriyama's very first video game project. It was his editor, Weekly Shonen Jump's Kazuhiko Torishima, who was the one that actually pushed the creator of the game, Yuji Horii, to bring Mr. Toriyama in on the very first game, which came out in 1986. Ronald Reagan was flexing on the Soviets while Mr. Toriyama and Horii were putting together this magic.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Apparently, it was Mr. Toriyama's clean line art and design sense on Dragon Quest that led to him being brought on for one of my all-time favorite games, Chrono Trigger. Tragically, Akira Toriyama passed away earlier this year, when after a surgery on a brain tumor he developed a subdural hematoma. That means that this is the first Dragon Quest game to come out without Mr. Toriyama's direct involvement. Naturally, this has made fans extra critical of any and all changes to Mr. Toriyama's work, especially since almost all of those known changes are art-based. That means that all of these things are directly affecting Mr. Toriyama's domain in the Dragon Quest franchise.
それから先の1年間というものはなかなかボツになるばっかりだったんですね。
そうです。書いても書いてもという、僕自身は全然しんどくなかったですけど。
You or I may argue that the changes are minor, but even a minor change to a masterpiece would be considered a big deal, especially to the people who have a lot of connection to that artist's work. Touching any of Mr. Toriyama's work on Dragon Quest, no matter the change, was going to cause some amount of backlash, and I feel that's at least partially deserved.
Don't you lecture me with your $30 haircut. Goku dies!
It's hard to put into words that someone who isn't connected to Mr. Toriyama's work would understand. We have to try and grasp how big of a cultural impact this man had. When Mr. Toriyama died, the two biggest news stories globally were his death and the United States State of the Union address. The French president had to release a statement. Mr. Toriyama's work has been referenced in movies, TV shows, and games across the world. I couldn't find an actual source to verify this, but people have been saying for years that cartel activity would drop in Central America when new Dragon Ball content came out. Alright? This man made hardened, murdering drug lords lay off some of that murdering for a bit just by the slipstream generated by how awesome his products were.
I mean, I don't want to oversell it, but it changes you forever.
Square Enix, despite probably knowing all of this, decided it was a good idea to start tweaking his work.
Excuse me, the what?
You shouldn't have did that.
I don't know, man. Maybe if someone's fans will gather by the thousands in cities the world over at the drop of a hat to coordinatedly do the same pose, maybe it's not a great idea to mess with their stuff. There is one added detail that I'm really curious about. This isn't the very first time the female warrior design has been edited, and that's the one people seem to be talking about the most. In the now defunct mobile games Dragon Quest Stars and Dragon Quest Rivals, the female warrior sported a slightly modified design with a black top worked into her armor, which I don't honestly think looks bad. I'm legitimately curious if Dragon Quest fans would be angry if Square Enix had gone with one of these modified designs from one of the earlier games. Honestly, if you're a Dragon Quest fan watching this, let me know in the comments below. I'm legitimately curious about that. It's obviously a bit different, but it's also a reference to another game in the series, so I could truthfully see it going either way. Despite having that potential out, though, Square Enix decided to go play in the minefield that is modifying the design of a universally beloved artist. What are you thinking?
What was I thinking?
The other detail that made this story just so fascinating to me was a recent interview with Yuji Horii, the creator of Dragon Quest, who is still working on the games. The interview is fascinating to me because it gives us just a tiny glimpse into why these changes occurred. So Mr. Horii and Kazuhiko Toriyama, the former Shonen Jump editor that I mentioned earlier, sat down for an interview at the Tokyo Game Show with a Japanese outlet known as Denfamico Gamer. I really hope I didn't butcher that one. In this interview, the subject of the remake Censorship came up. The thing that makes this interesting, though, is who Yuji Horii and Mr. Toriyama put the blame on for this censorship.
Why are we here, man?
Because I needed someone to blame for how unhappy I am, okay?
Mr. Horii, in this interview, puts the blame on the need to adjust content to appease Western regulators. He says, when there's too much exposure, it means we won't be able to sell it as an all-ages product. The thing he didn't mention specifically is which regulators he has to appease. After Horii's remarks, someone off-screen says that rules vary country to country. When trying to sell widely, there's the issue of having to comply with the strictest regulations. Mr. Toriyama talks about American regulators when it comes to his problems over the years getting manga published, but it's unclear what regulators he's talking about when it comes to this game. The line a lot of people are honing in on is Mr. Toriyama's line that he had where doing business with such a ridiculous country is really frustrating. Because honestly, I think that's something everyone can feel right now. Things are just ridiculous, man. Just so much, lots of dumb stuff.
What? That's really dumb.
Now, I'm not opposed to age ratings. I quite like them in theory, but this story gives us a look at just how they can be weaponized against creators.
The following contains violence, coarse language, and adult situations not suitable for minors. Viewer discretion is advised.
I don't know crap about the European age rating systems, so I'll use the US one. From what I can track down, every version of Dragon Quest III that's been released in the US has a rated T for teen rating. The remake is rated E10+. Square Enix was apparently chomping at the bit to lower the age rating of this game by 1 stage. And I do not understand why.
Okay. Got it. I'll never think about that again.
T for Teen and E10+ have an almost identical demographic. I can only conclude that some corporate bean counter somewhere had some theory that the game would sell more copies if it was a single age rating lower.
Look at how much money that is!
And clearly Square Enix demanded that Mr. Horii and the crew do whatever is required from the regulators to get that rating, which I find truly flabbergasting. The other part of the interview that's worth honing in on is Mr. Horii's comments on your choice of main character. He says, in Dragon Quest, you used to be able to choose between a male and female main character, but now you can't pick between a man and woman anymore. We have to label them as Type 1 and Type 2. Because yeah, that's happening too. I didn't mention it at the top because there isn't really a good image I can use, especially if you don't speak or read Japanese. But that is happening. You don't pick men and women anymore. You pick body type 1 and body type 2, which is so dang dumb.
I have no idea what I just saw, but it made me a little stupider.
Now, to be completely fair, I'm not sure who is specifically to be blamed for which parts of this general debacle. However, based on Mr. Horii's comments, I think there are 2 key villains in our little narrative that we've got going. Who's the bigger villain? I'll leave that up for you to decide. First, there are the Western age rating regulators. They are the ones who have to set the requirements that Dragon Quest and all game creators in Japan and the world over have to follow. In Japan, believe it or not, does not buy in with our Western ideas of gender ideology. They have their own culture where they do things differently because it's a different place, in a different time, in a different culture. That's normal. Japanese people are entitled to their culture, and if we, as outsiders, are going to participate in that culture, maybe we should take it as it currently is, instead of trying to cram it into a mold to fit our ideas of how things should work.
This contraption is
better than I ever imagined, Gorilla Grodd! Ooh, this country really will belong to the Joker!
It seems that online people have had a lot of problems with localizers recently, and I can't honestly fault anyone who feels like something is lost when Japanese pop culture products are changing themselves to adhere to vague Western regulation standards.
Have no fear! Government is here!
Oh no.
The second bad guy here is Square Enix themselves. Mr. Horii, and I can assume the people who work directly with him on these games, seems to be pretty clean to me, at least based on these statements. However, Square Enix has some sort of corruption in their management tiers. It's always good for us to remember that there is a difference between the guys who make games and the companies that publish these games. Square Enix, for example, has publicly had ESG and DEI programs. I found a 10-page environmental social governance PDF published by Square Enix on their website. And that website also features plenty of material on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of the higher-ups at Square Enix were definitely sold this ESG, DEI nonsense.
It's false. No way. Not this time. We created it.
This garbage really has infiltrated most big corporations in the West, and I can only assume that Square Enix was just told that this is how you do business in the West. I mean, that's the nicest read I can really give them, is that they just didn't know better and were hoodwinked into believing that this was a good business practice for a global company. But based on the recent releases, it just isn't. Square Enix has reportedly lost over $2 billion in its market value since last year, and has had multiple big budget products that have just failed to get off the ground. Plus, they make a bunch of Disney IPs, so I think we all know how well that's going for them.
This stock just keeps going down and down and down, and then Bob Iger is all like, no, what's going on with my stocks? No, nothing can...
I really hope Square turns it around. While I'm not a die-hard fan of many of their products, as a lover of RPGs and gaming history, it is a shame to see an icon suffer like this.
You've killed me!
Good.
It's like watching a once-beloved family pet that belongs to your friend getting super old and sickly. It's just sad. Hopefully, Dragon Quest III will be one of the last games that screws this up, and Square Enix will start to turn this around. The first step to that recovery will be dropping the ESG and DEI nonsense and getting back to making the games that gamers love. The games that define the careers of legends like Akira Toriyama. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.